Hello, here we are again. I hope you all had a restful spring break and that you were able to do some reading in the Magic Mountain, which we turn again now today. And we begin where we left off last time, at Director Barron's apartment, where Hans has come by invitation with Joachim for coffee, but really because he wants to see Barron's portrait of Claudia. He's heard about this and is consumed with curiosity, but not by jealousy as he'd felt at first. Although he has still not exchanged even words with Claudia, Hans's passionate attraction to her is so intense that he craves an intimate knowledge of her inner life and being. He wants to discover the secrets of her mind and her beautiful diseased body. Like Swann, then, Hans is driven by a desire both for physical and metaphysical possession. Well, after politely examining some of Barron's other canvases, Hans sees the portrait of Claudia and is galvanized, despite the rather clumsy technique, which makes it, as the narrator phrases it, a botched-up job only vaguely corresponding to its model. Nevertheless, Hans understands that only Barron's, a man familiar with the innermost recesses of Claudia's body as her physician, only a man who has examined her under a microscope and X-ray machine, could possibly have painted a picture that he sees here. And Mann makes it clear that only a man in the throes of Dionysian desire for a passionate, diseased Russian woman could relish the painted likeness the way Hans does. Insofar as Barron's is an artist, he is clearly more a Dionysian than an Apollonian one. His interest is not in the ideal forms that Settembrini celebrates, but rather in material ones, bodily ones. Barron's paints landscapes, still lifes, and a few human subjects, of which Claudia is clearly his most interesting. His Dionysian inclinations are also suggested by the coffee service. He pours the coffee from a dispenser bearing an erotic design, a gift to him from an Egyptian princess. In his rendering of Claudia, Barron's drew upon his medical understanding of the biology of her constituent parts to evoke the distinctive features of her innermost female body. His portrait conveys a penetrating understanding of Claudia's skin, her layers of fat, her secretions, and inner organs, but not in a cold anatomical way. Rather, despite the painting's technical limitations, Hans sees that the picture is almost like an X-ray in that it captures the beautiful but corruptible corporeality of Claudia, which has fascinated Hans from the moment that he first saw her. Now, through Barron's art, he seems to see her as if it were from the inside out. Here's how Mann describes Hans's response on seeing it. We're told that the bear's skin had obviously been painted with feeling, and despite a certain aura of sweetness, the artist had been able to endow it with a scientific reality and lifelike accuracy. You could imagine that you saw perspiration, the invisible vapors of life rising from the flesh, that if you were to press your lips against the surface, you would smell a human body and not paint and varnish. Now, flattered by Hans's praise, Barron's explains to him how Claudia's skin is composed of cells and moistened by sweat glands, how the slant of her eyes, which Barron's calls a titillating little mystery, is produced by a particular fold of skin, and how her female figure, hips and bust, are the product of fat tissue. He says, you can examine it under a microscope for organic accuracy, and you'll see not just the horny and muscle and mucous layers of the outer skin, but along with them the imagined rectilinear layer with its sebaceous glands, sweat glands, blood vessels, papillae, and beneath that there's the layer of fat, the upholstery, the foundation of fat cells that creates the gorgeous female form, Barron's explains. Now, Hans is not disillusioned by this dissection of Claudia's organic body on canvas or in language, because he has never idealized Claudia as a pure or perfect mental image in the Proustian sense. Instead, as we've seen, Hans has desired in Claudia the alluring corporeality of her eroticized body and of her disease, and indeed the two The disease and the eroticism are inseparable for him in his attraction. For Hans, Berend's painting is then a repudiation of Settembrini's Apollonian concept of artistic form as a matter of disembodied symmetry and rational proportion and harmonious design. In this scene, Berens is his teacher, Sans's teacher, not Settembrini, not the Italian humanist. And through Berens' disquisition, Hans learns that the female outline that was revered by Apollonians for its ideal form, exalted in works of classical sculpture, that form is actually founded not upon abstract symmetry, but on the presence of subdermal tissue in the breasts and in the abdomen. Hans is moved to delight by the organic mysteries of fat, blood vessels, and especially lymph, which Berens calls the body's, quote, most refined and intimate substance. We learn that Claudia's tuberculosis in particular is a tuberculosis of the lymphatic vessels, the most intimate and refined part of her body. Well, after seeing the portrait and listening to the director, Hans finds that it has embodied the living Claudia, whom he has longed to touch, but has yet even spoken to. And as if by substitution then, so moved is he by this object that seems in so many ways a kind of extension of her, that he picks up Berens' portrait off the wall and begins carrying it around the apartment with him, even taking it to the table with him when they sit down to drink coffee. Berens' explanations of how organic chemistry has produced the ravishing, disease-ridden body of Claudia moves Hans to rapture and to passionate curiosity that, of course, perplexes his long-suffering cousin. Hans said nothing at first, and then, "Yes," he remarked softly after a pause, "it's true. I could easily have become a doctor. The formation of breast milk, the lymph of the legs, it all interests me very much, Director. The body," and he suddenly cried in a rapturous outburst, "the flesh, the human body, what is it? What is it made of? Tell us now this very afternoon, Director Berens. Tell us once and for all in precise terms so that we may know." Now, Hans will repeat this ecstatic celebration of the body's beautiful form and corruptibility in his own words when he declares his love to Claudia in the Walpurgisknacht chapter. But before we reach that chapter, which is the climax of Hans's love and the climax of the first half of the Magic Mountain, before we reach it, we must first pass with Hans through two long, demanding chapters. Both are chapters of education into the nature of the body and its movement toward death, but in very different ways. The first is research, and the second, the danse macabre. Okay. Just before leaving Berens, Hans had declared, quote, "If someone is interested in life, it's death he's particularly interested in." We realize at this moment that Hans's long-standing interest in death, both as a solemn mystery and as a process of physical corruption, is necessary if he is to embrace life, because, as he notes, death is a part of life. To put it simply, Hans must face death and understand it if he is to resist the lure of death and rise above it and go on living. Now, one of the central questions in the novel is, can he do this? Can Hans's encounters with death be necessary rites of passage in his movement toward an embrace of life and ultimately in the discovery of his mythic identity? Or, as Settembrini and Joachim both fear, is Hans's particular fascination with death a danger that will destroy him as he approaches it from various perspectives, like a moth circling a flame? Well, in the next three chapters, Hans is going to explore death and its relationship to life. First in the books that he reads, then in his visits to dying patients, and finally and above all in his climactic encounter with Claudia. All right, now after months at the Berghof, winter is set in, and Hans spends hours wrapped up reading anatomy texts as he lies out on his balcony. And as he does so, Mon tells us, time seems to thicken like the snow covering the landscape. Although the hours of his reading, in which he feels such fascination, any particular hour may seem to pass quickly in this state of intellectual excitement, he finds that over a period of weeks, time seems to slow down for him because it has become so filled with new discoveries in his research, so absolutely infused with novelty and riveting intellectual stimulation that, again, over a period of time, what passes quickly in a moment seems to have somehow gained a kind of depth and slowness over a larger period. Well, Hans cherishes the hours that he has to peruse these books and come to these discoveries. And we're told that he wants time to pass more slowly so that he can continue these inquiries. Even when he's taking his temperature, he's thinking and discovering things, as the narrator tells us. Those 60 seconds times 7, taking his temperature, that you spent with the thermometer between your lips so that you could extend the line in your chart, Hans thinks. Those were extremely tenacious, important seconds. They stretched out into a little eternity, leaving extraordinarily dense deposits in the scurrying shadow of grand time. All of this time valued, taking his temperature now, which is no longer boring, because it's filled with thought as he is doing so. Now, in this, as in so many other ways, Hans differs from his fellow patients, who seem incapable of such time-thickening pleasures, and who, we're told instead, even though their time may be limited, behave this way. They were all feverish with accelerated metabolisms, the whole physical organism working at a faster augmented pace, which may well have had something to do with the way they drove time like a herd before them. Now, faced with death, with a shortened time span, it is certainly a paradox, then, that most of the other patients at the sanatorium compulsively want to burn away the weeks or months that they have left, always looking ahead and rarely savoring the experiential moment in and of itself, as Mon puts it, driving time like a herd before them. Most of the patients, too, are too agitated, too foot-forward driven to engage in reading or reflective thought at all. And again, here Hans clearly differs, because he devotes his days and nights not just to reading, but to thinking about what he has read, to pondering questions, certainly in ways that he would have been capable of in the flatlands. Inspired by his conversation with barons, Hans begins reading voraciously about physiology, but this learning takes Hans far beyond the basic scientific knowledge of organic growth and dissolution. Just as Hans, as we have seen, is a dialectical thinker who juxtaposes ideas, he is also, in a certain way, a synthetic thinker who, while he may never arrive at conclusions, nonetheless tries to bridge differences and oppositions, if only hypothetically and provisionally, as he reads any particular thing. He tries to harmonize separate concepts and bridge separate disciplines. Thus, for example, as he is reading in his books on anatomy, reading about, for example, the bone of the upper thigh, he moves from the thought of this as a part of the human body to this observation. He was delighted to see it, for now he realized that his relationship to the femur and to organic nature in general was threefold: lyric, medical, and technical. It came as a great inspiration, and these three relationships, Hans believed, were a unity within the human mind, were schools of humanist thought, variations on one and the same pressing concern. Moved then to a humanist inquiry in a broader sense than Sedembrini's, Hans finds that his study of bones and muscles, his study of the mysterious formation and division of cells that produce those bones and muscles, that these things prompt him to ask himself questions about the origin of things, questions that would seem to fall outside the specific sphere merely of a medical text. Now, all of the questions that Hans asks himself in this chapter of research essentially have to do with the origin of things, the mystery of life that Hans knows science alone cannot answer. Because the fundamental question that Hans asks repeatedly is a metaphysical one. What was life? And he knows that life isn't just organic matter that can be explained in a physiology text. Rather, Hans asks, what was life really? It was warmth, and warmth produced by instability, attempting to preserve form. It was a fever of matter that accompanies the ceaseless dissolution and renewal of protein molecules, themselves transient in their complex and intricate construction. It was not matter, and it was not spirit, but it was something in between the two, a phenomenon born by matter, like a rainbow above a waterfall, like a flame. But it was not matter, nor was it completely spirit, this thing that is life. Now, note here, even though he's reading a book on physiology, the word spirit continually enters Hans's thinking, and it's crucial. Settembrini would deny that the soul exists at all, and Behrens would say that if spirit exists, it certainly plays no role in physiology, in what is life. But Hans believes, as we've seen, in a spiritual dimension to human experience, and the primary source of this feeling has been its experience of death, not merely as bodily disintegration, but as a solemn phenomenon that he feels is profoundly transcendental. Now, the riddle, then, of what life is, for Hans, seems to be a riddle of the nature of the combination of matter and spirit, a combination that we remember traces back to Mann's own Gnostic myth. But for Hans, who is unfamiliar with that particular myth, for Hans, the question of what is life in its combination of matter and spirit leads him to formulate three related questions that involve moments, if you will, of the passage of one state of being to another. First question Hans asks is, how did lifeless matter become life? How and why, in short, did life arise out of non-life? Thus, he asks, between life and animate and inanimate nature, there was a yawning abyss which research sought to bridge. People endeavored to close the abyss with theories. It swallowed them whole and was still not an inch less broad or deep. To move from inanimate nature to life, even in its simplest form. How? That's Hans's first question. From that question arises a second that reflect Hans's struggles to understand this thing called life. And this concerns the mysterious change from rudimentary cellular life to sentient life. That is, life sufficiently complex that the organism knows that it is alive. He thinks it was impossible to tie the emergence of consciousness to any particular point in life's general or individual history, to link it, for instance, to the presence of a nervous system. The lowest animals had no nervous systems, yet alone a cerebral cortex, and yet no one dared deny that they were capable of responding to stimuli. At what point did molecular life somehow develop to the point where the creature is aware that it is alive? That elemental sense of consciousness. And from there arises the third question in this process of mysterious transitions. How and when did sentient life become self-conscious life? That is, life, particularly human life, capable of reflecting on itself, as Hans is doing in these earnest inquiries. Not just a sense of being alive, but a question of why one is alive and the capacity to reflect upon one's own act of thinking. This, too, fascinates and perplexes Hans. Consciousness of self was an inherent function of matter once it was organized as life, and if that function was enhanced, it turned against the organism that bore it, strove to fathom and explain the very phenomenon that produced it, a hope-filled and hopeless striving of life to comprehend its self. Thus, a little bit later, again, Hans puts it to him, or the narrator's indirect discourse puts it this way. With its complicated interior, a network of pipes and crevices, including openings into the world outside, understood that this self was a living entity of a higher order, far removed from those other simple organisms that breathed, fed, even thought with just the surface of their bodies. The difference between consciousness, in short, and self-consciousness, this higher order he speaks of, this sense of a mind that seeks to understand the phenomenon of its own existence. Now, Hans notes that in its embryonic form, a human fetus is indistinguishable from that of a pig, a detail, by the way, that looks ahead to Walpurgisnacht. So how then did the change from the consciousness of a pig, which knows that it's alive and nothing more, to the consciousness of a human being that can reflect upon the fact of its own existence, occur? Well, note that the human being, as Hans conceives of it, is a uniquely self-conscious entity, capable of questioning its own origins, and yet somewhere along the line this must have occurred, but it's nowhere apparent. Now, if we still then carry within us remnants of more primitive animal forms that we resemble so closely in the womb, how could one possibly determine where this spark of the thing we call self-consciousness arose? Where does the defining spark also of what Hans calls spirit enter the evolutionary process? Well, Hans finds that in his reading, science alone offers no adequate explanation to any of the three extraordinary transitions that underlie the central question in his period of meditation, which is, what is life itself? Now, there are two other questions in Hans's inquiries that one might say stand at either end of the three that I have just talked about. He comes to the first of these by asking himself, what is the smallest particle of matter? Well, he thinks about cells. Cells, of course, are the building blocks of our organs. But cells are composed of genes. Genes are composed of atoms. Atoms are composed or contain electrons. As he thinks this way, microcosmically, there seems to be no end to the infinitesimal subdivision of matter. And this attempt then to penetrate to the smallest unit of substance prompts Hans to ask this question: how did matter itself come into being? Before matter ever somehow quickened into life, how was it that matter ever arose? He thinks there could be no limit to the divisions as long as it yielded organic entities, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was, where did they start? When one looked at the chemical molecules, one found oneself at the edge of a yawning abyss, far more mysterious than the one between organic and inorganic life. At the edge of the abyss between the material and the non-material. How did the material come to exist? A tiny initial ephemeral concentration of something immaterial, of something not yet matter, but related to matter, of energy that one could not yet or perhaps no longer think of as matter, but rather as both a medium and a boundary between the material and the immaterial. But that posed the question of another kind, of a spontaneous generation. How does non-matter become matter? What is the origin of the physical universe? Now, note that in asking himself this question, Hans uses language that of necessity invokes the realm of spirit. He can't find any scientific explanation for this initial crossing from immateriality to material creation. But one notable thing is that his synthesizing intelligence allows Hans to see a symmetry of design in all creation. The microcosm of the electron spinning around an atom's nucleus, he realizes, is reflected in the macrocosm of stars spinning in galaxies and planets spinning around stars. The atom was an energy-laden cosmic system, Hans thought, in which planets rotated frantically around a sun-like center, while comets raced through the ether at speed of light, held in their eccentric orbits by the gravity of the core. That was not merely a metaphor, any more than it would be a metaphor to call the body a multicelled creature in tiny cells. No, Hans begins to think, in the same way, the innermost recesses of nature were repeated, mirrored on a vast scale in the macrocosmic world of stars, whose swarms, clusters, grouping, and constellations pale against the moon. Now, one might say that this is the sort of insight that almost any bright adolescent comes to at some point. But Hans goes further than merely noting that there seems to be a symmetry between atoms, say, and the stars. He goes further to imagine that each atom is a universe in itself, reflecting the outer universe, and that in each of these trillions and trillions of little universes, there is a figure, a Hans Castorp, at this very instant, doing and speculating just as he is. We're told, but that did not, that perhaps in inner world after inner world within his own nature, Hans was present over and over again, 100 young Hans Castorps, all wrapped up warmly, but with numbed fingers and flushed face, gazing out from a balcony onto a frosty moonlight night high in the Alps and studying, out of humanistic and medical interest, the life of the human body, that the self is replicated at every possible level, in every conceivable dimension of vastness or smallness. Now, Hans's wild speculation here poses the final question of origins in this chapter, which is at the opposite end of that spectrum of transitions that I described. And that is not how did non-materiality become materiality, the quickening into matter, but rather, at the other end, how did Hans become Hans? How out of self-conscious organic life did he emerge as a distinctive entity in this or any other universe? It is this existential question, more than any of those that preceded in Hans's research chapter, that is going to increasingly occupy his thoughts and dominate, really, Mann's own in the second half of the novel. Essentially, the question becomes then more and more not what is life, as we have seen, but who am I? Can Hans possibly offer answers to these urgent questions about the origins and causes behind the existence of matter, life, consciousness, and himself? Well, he tries, and he tries to do so not in a scientific idiom, but rather, certainly not in the scientific spirit, say, of Behrens, nor in the rational language of Settembrini. Rather, essentially, he tries to conceive of answers, possible answers to these questions, in a kind of mythical context, a myth that Hans is fashioning on his own. Even though Hans has no knowledge of Mann's own Hebraic Gnosticism, the basis for the monomyth I've described, nonetheless, Hans's explanation at the end of the research chapter to himself, provisional though it may be, is really a version of Mann's own foundational Gnostic myth, but with a new and distinctive element. In Hans's mythic formulation, the succession of changes leading from non-matter all the way to human consciousness and to himself are all governed by a single process that Hans labels disease. The thing that Hans, of course, is suffering from at this very moment, and that has inspired all of his reading. Disease was life's lascivious form, and for its part, what was life? Was it perhaps only an infectious disease of matter, just as the so-called spontaneous generation of matter was perhaps only an illness, a cancerous stimulation of the immaterial? The first step toward evil, toward lust and death, was doubtlessly taken when, as a result of the trickle of some unknown incursion, spirit increased in density for the first time, creating a pathologically rank growth of tissue that formed, half in pleasure, half in defense, as the prelude to matter, the transition from the immaterial to the material. This was creation's true fall, its original sin. The second spontaneous generation, the birth of the organic from the inorganic, was only the sad progression of corporeality into consciousness, just as disease in an organism was the intoxicating enchantment and crude accentuation of its own corporeality. Life was only the next step along the reckless path of spirit turned disreputable, matter blushing in reflex, both sensitive and receptive to whatever had awakened it. Now, in this dense passage, what we find essentially is this. It's a version of Mann's own Gnostic myth of the fall of Adam Quad Mann into materiality, which Hans refers to as the unknown incursion. It is essentially the story of spirit sickening into matter, which marks the creation of substance out of nothing. But also this fall, the equivalent of Adam Quad Mann falling into matter. Now, this description of the hybrid phenomenon of spirit-infused matter leads Hans then from this vision of spirit somehow generating matter, becoming infused with it, as a disease. That disease then sickens into rank organic life. And indeed, this sickening is a progression of corporeality until finally corporeality achieves consciousness. Human life is, in short, a third stage sickening, and love, as a narcissistic urge to full self-knowledge, is a final stage of life's fevered sickening, or one might say a sickening that began with spirit somehow secreting matter and becoming involved in it all the more fully through a series of iterations. But what is the ultimate end of all of this? Well, the ultimate end, of course, is death. Now, Hans' interest in anatomy, remember, began with a preoccupation with death as he was talking to barons. But now, having reached the point where he recognizes that in this mythic vision of the way in which spirit somehow becomes entwined with matter and sickens finally into self-consciousness, love, and moves toward death. Having reached that point, at the end of this remarkable chapter, what we find is that Hans turns away from death in a simplistic or reductive sense and begins thinking about life with a sense of greater fascination. Now, remember something here. Up until now, it has been a kind of theoretical consideration of the relationship between death and life. He sees that life is a disease-ridden phenomenon from its very origins, in which essentially spirit sickens into matter and matter sickens into consciousness. But at the same time, he realizes that life, nonetheless, is irresistibly alluring in itself. And so, whose image comes to mind when he thinks about life? Well, we recall that during these meditations, Hans is in certain moments convinced that his temperature is rising because of the, quote, mental excitement that he feels. But the real cause of that of that change in his temperature is very likely the bodily image of Claudia that Hans has in his mind very often as he is reading about the body. And so, at the end of the chapter, as he drifts off to sleep with his medical text on his lap, at the end of this research chapter, it is Claudia's voluptuous face and form who appear to Hans in a dream. He beheld the image of life, its voluptuous limbs, its flesh-born beauty. She had loosened her hands from the back of her neck and her arms. She spread them wide now, revealing the inner surface, especially the tender skin at the elbow with its blood vessels, two large bluish branching veins. Her arms were of inexpressible sweetness. She bent toward him, bent down to him, over him. He sensed her organic aroma, sensed the lace-like pounding of her heart. He saw an embrace, hot and tender around his neck, and he felt it, melting with lust and dismay. He laid his hands on her upper arms. There were her grainy skin stretched taut over the triceps and was blissfully cool to the touch. He felt the moist suckle of her kiss on his lips. Now, you'll note that Hans's erotic dream is clearly a wish fulfillment of his still unenacted desire for Claudia, because though she is unnamed here, it is clearly she whom he is dreaming of. But this is also a moment of visionary synthesis in which the sensuous form and beauty that embody life, because this begins, the image of life, are inseparable from the hints of decay that he sees within this voluptuous living body in his dream. As Claudia's imagined body opens to Hans's gaze and to his smell and to his touch, that body's corruptibility is evident in the grainy skin, the bluish veins, the organic aroma itself of her body that he smells here, caused by bacterial decomposition. In short, even in this dream in which he embraces life, Hans is drawn still to death. And how could he not be if, after all, life is generated by disease, and if, as he says, the processes of living and dying are continually and inseparably joined? This is, in a sense, a vision of passionate, sensate being, yet also a vision of sensuate, passionate being corrupted. The kiss that he imagines Claudia giving him seems not just forbidden, but dangerous, and even perhaps vaguely vampiric, as he feels the moist suckle of her lips on his. In short, erotic and yet linked with disease, conjoining pleasure and death. This is not an innocent kiss. Okay, we turn now to Danse Macabre, French for Dance of Death, a icon of medieval art, deriving from primarily the bubonic plague of the 14th century, in which death, the grim reaper, was depicted leading a chain of dying men and women by the hand in what looks like a grotesque death. Any of you who have ever seen Bergman's The Seventh Seal will be familiar with this. Dance leading the dying in a sort of frenzied movement to the grave. Now, Mann's use of the chapter title, The Dance of Death, points then in several directions. First, Hans's visitation to dying patients with Joachim in tow in this chapter is, if you will, a kind of performative dance of death, or perhaps better, one might say, a dance with death that he is making. Because through these encounters, Hans sees mortality in a variety of different forms and engages with the dying. Without consciously understanding it, Hans is engaging in a kind of initiatory rite by examining death up close. This thing that fascinates him as an aspect of life, but also more dangerously poses attraction in and of itself. From a mythic point of view, this seems to be then a kind of series of encounters that he needs to make in the course of his existence. Having pondered the origin and the nature of life in his research, Hans must now examine death, not through textbooks and not through metaphysical speculation, but examine it now up close, face to face. Now, the Dance of Death also refers to the different ways in which the patients that Hans visits engage with the imminence of death. Each, in a certain way, does his own dance in relation to the fact of his imminent death or her imminent death, both physically and psychologically. Finally, the frenzied dance of death that Hans and Joachim see, in a certain sense, men and women engaging in figuratively is something they also sometimes engage in quite literally. A dance of death of the kind that they see when they go into town and see this. The dancing would get much more lively as the evening progressed. Countless patients from the various sanatoriums and patients living brazenly on their own in the Kurhaus and other hotels would join in later in much greater number than now, and many a serious case had danced his way to eternity here, first tossing back the beaker of life and then hemorrhaging one last time. Well, all of these different implications then cluster around the title, but one might note that the spectacle in town that I've just described anticipates the one, of course, at the Berghof on Mardi Gras, which is another self-destructive dance of death among terminally ill patients, and one that is explicitly forbidden on even on the night of Mardi Gras, a time of license and merriment, because that kind of dancing and the feelings associated with it seem to propel them toward the grave, to worsen their lung infections. Now, why after his dream of embracing life as well as death in the form of Claudia, why after that does Hans decide to undertake these missions to visit the dying? Well, his mythic motivations are, as I've suggested, unconscious, the need for this kind of rite of passage, racially remembered. But I would suggest that it is also notable that Hans, though he is unaware of that particular mythic impulse, says, much to Joachim's horror, that death and I are on old terms. Death is an old acquaintance of mine. But he hasn't fully come to understand death, despite its association with his childhood past, as fully as he needs to. I would point out, though, that while this may be an unconscious motivation on his part then, this need to encounter it more fully in his movement through life and in his way of trying to understand and embrace life, nonetheless, there are conscious reasons why Hans tells himself he is doing this. Conscious motives, one might say. First, Hans wants to understand suffering as a prelude to death. Far from wishing to eliminate suffering as an obscenity, the way Settembrini does in his quixotic volume on the elimination of human suffering, to which he's contributing, far from that, Hans wants to observe and understand suffering. To eliminate suffering, Hans thinks, would be, quote, immoral. It would be an assault on human dignity. Hans thinks of this after hearing of the death of that Austrian horseman whose cough, you remember, he had heard on the first day at the sanitarium and responded to it with both horror and fascination. He notes that this horseman struggled against death in a state of great suffering, clinging to life. And there is, for Hans, something deeply ennobling about this. Hans disputed emphatically. The living had their rights too, and so on. Hans disputed this emphatically. His cousin was almost sounding like Settembrini, with no respect or reverence for suffering. The horseman had died in the end, yes, and there was nothing funny about that. You could only show your concern, and a dying man deserved every kindness, every honor that they could bestow on him, Hans Constorp insisted. And part of that honor that he is bestowing on the Austrian horseman is that that man dignified himself in dying through his own suffering. Now, a second reason that Hans begins visiting the dying, again in his own motivation, is as a form of protest. A protest against the dishonest denial of death that he sees all around him. The deceased, after all, at the Berghof are removed when no one is looking. Death is not openly discussed or even at times alluded to. Even Settembrini seems to be part of this. His rational denial of the afterlife is inadequate to Hans, of course, but he also finds that Settembrini robs death of his dignity by refusing to talk about it at all. A third conscious motive for Hans's visits to dying patients is his desire to explore the spiritual aspect of death. And here, as we'll see, he'll be rather disappointed, but it's certainly something that motivates him. For example, when he is talking about the particular language that one ought to speak of death in, it's Latin. He says, you see, when it comes to death, when one speaks to the dead or about them, Latin comes on its own. It's the official language in such cases, which only points to the special nature of death. And he notes that in particular, there's a special kind of Latin, not the regular Latin dialect, but rather the dialect of monks, chanting in Latin in the Middle Ages, so to speak, a kind of muted subterranean monotone. Yes, death as a sacred mystery has a special kind of language, a special kind of rhythm. And as such, he finds that he hopes to see evidence of this kind of spiritual nature of death in his visits. He finds that, we're told, his protest against the egotism prevalent at the Berghof was only one of the reasons, not just the denial of death. Likewise, playing a role was Hans's own spiritual need to take suffering and death seriously, to pay attention to them, a need he hoped would be nourished and satisfied by his getting closer to the seriously ill and the dying. Now, Settembrini sees this and warns Hans against, quote, these spiritual dangers in his ministrations to the dying, this attempt to find some spiritual meaning in it, just as Settembrini also warns Hans against the erotic fleshly dangers of his attraction to Claudia, calling Hans repeatedly one of life's problem children. Well, Settembrini, the master of languages we've seen, doesn't even like to use the word death in any of the languages he speaks. And so Hans supplies it for him, forcing Settembrini to face it when he says, I've been concerning myself with death's children. You may call me one of life's problem children. I'm interested in death's children. That's what you mean. Now, I think it would be wrong not to include among Hans's conscious motivations another one, and that is simple human compassion. But that compassion for the dying operates, as I've suggested, not only in combination with protest and with a spiritual yearning, but it also operates, I think, unmistakably with still another motive. And again, one I think that Hans is to some degree conscious of, and that is a dangerous fascination with death and with incurable illness as forms of bodily corruption. Hans is moved in part here by a perverse interest, if you will, in the sensuality of mortality, in the way in which the body disintegrates and deliquesces. Now, in a sense, this begins even, this particular interest behind his visits begins even before he begins them, when he asks Behrens, who is surprised by the request, to see the body of the Austrian horseman, quote, to make a personal inspection of the deceased. This is not something tuberculosis patients usually want to do when one of their neighbors dies. Yet, moved by all of the conscious and unconscious motives that I have been describing, Hans's experience as a consoling visitor and in kind of inquiring explorer of the dying, all of this proves to be, for him, less satisfying, less edifying than he had hoped it would be. Why? Well, part of the problem is that many of the patients are unwilling to face the imminence of their own death, such as Lila, the first teenage girl that Hans and Joachim attend. First, they send her a potted plant, and then they come to visit her. And the girl is delighted to see them, but not as harbingers of death, but rather as young men who bring a blush of pleasure to her cheek. Far from finding any sense of spirituality here or awareness of death, far from understanding anything about the way in which dying individuals face and experience their end, Hans is instead left with the memory of the girl completely unwilling to face her own mortality, even as she literally dissolves, it seems, as he holds her hand. He did hold Lila's hand in his for a long time, a hot hand that was not merely damp, but downright wet, for the child was perspiring excessively, her sweat glands producing so much water that her flesh would have shriveled and died out long before had she not managed to keep pace with her body's transduction by thirstily downing great quantities of lemonade. More flagrant than this even is the behavior of the disease-ravaged Frau Mollenkroft. She's an adulteress who flirts shamelessly with the two cousins during their visit. We're told that her fiery femininity triumphed over her eczema, half covered her face. Other sufferers that Hans encounters disillusion him by refusing to acknowledge that they are dying and or by finding and expressing no higher meaning in it. Such, for example, as the young businessman Rotbein. Facing a seemingly hopeless operation, Rotbein can only think of his demise economically from the point of view of business practices. Hans is looking, meanwhile, to confirm his idea that the approach and experience of death prompt in the dying some kind of numinous discovery. You'll remember that he had seen briefly early in his stay an expression on the face of an individual on the verge of death that had somehow transmitted a sense of powerful spiritual nobility and self-awareness. He doesn't see that in any of the people he comes to visit. Indeed, Rotbein's pragmatic approach to non-existence as a kind of business transaction is as disillusioning for Hans as that epileptic patient's response to a seizure had been. That response was so terrible that the epileptic's contortions and foaming at the mouth sent the other patients rushing out of the dining hall in hysterics. But afterwards, to Hans' distress, the epileptic man calmly returned to the table and finished his meal. Well, Krakowski's idea that epilepsy is an orgasm of the brain might be laughable, but Hans sees that, quote, there was nothing to inspire reverence for his suffering in the man's appearance afterward. He seemed on the verge of death, and yet it seems to have meant nothing. Now, much of the suffering that Hans witnesses as he makes his rounds is even more grotesque and undignified than that. Frau Zimmermann, who was, quote, overfilled with oxygen after a pneumothorax operation by a quack doctor outside the sanitarium, she is in constant misery, and yet, in her discomfort, she is physiologically driven to hysterical laughter, as if, quote, she found the state of hovering between life and death too funny for words. This appalls Hans. What Hans sees in his visits, in short then, is not individuals facing death with clarity and nobility, nor any spiritual character in them somehow emerging as they die. Nothing like what he'd briefly glimpsed in the eyes of that man. What he encounters instead is largely the rank, horrific, corporeal side of disease approaching death. And that is fascinating for Hans, as I've suggested, but it is also not enough. It's reductive, limited, one-dimensional. Consider, for example, Herr Fergie, whose physical agony during an unanesthetized lung operation reveals, among other things, that in addition to language's other intrinsic shortcomings, there are certain states of experience that the body undergoes that are too horrific for words to capture. And Fergie, nonetheless, speaks this way. As he was awake during this operation, the doctor begins to explore the pleural lining with a blunt instrument. It has to be blunt so it doesn't puncture too soon. He explores to find the right place to make the puncture and let in the gas, but the way he does it, the way he rubs the instrument around the pleural lining, gentlemen, that's what did me in. It was all over for me, simply indescribable. The pleural lining, gentlemen, should never be touched. It cannot be touched. It's taboo. No. There was the unbearable stench of hydrogen sulfide, just like the stench of hell itself, just like hell must stink. And as I blacked out, I heard myself laughing. Not a human laugh, but the most indecent, disgusting laugh I've ever heard. Because when they explore your pleural lining, gentlemen, it's as if you're being tickled in the most infamous, intense, inhuman way. That's just the damn disgraceful torment it feels like. That's what pleural shock is like. And may the good Lord spare you the experience. So here is pleural... Okay. Hovering between life and death in this moment of operation, and instead of any kind of discovery, he is filled instead with this uncontrollable sense of being tickled, a sense of the disgraceful, a sense of the tormented, blacking out in a state of hysterical and unmanageable and agonized laughter. There is in this, then, in such descriptions of near-death experiences and visits to the dying, for Hans, nothing that his spirit-longing soul can attach itself to. The closest he comes to finding the dignified approach to terminal illness, clear-sighted and somehow ennobling or purifying, seems to come in the form of Karen, a young woman whom he and Joachim visit in her lodgings, not at the Berghof, but in a nearby village of Dorf. Unlike all the others, Karen admits that she knows that she is soon going to die. She faces it so honestly and with such equanimity, in fact, that she agrees to accompany the cousins to the cemetery where she will soon be buried. And indeed, as they look down on the graves, this is what we are told. Somewhere deep in the press of resting places, toward the midpoint of the meadow, between two mounds whose gravestones were hung with artificial wreaths, was a flat, regular, unoccupied place, the length of a human body, and the three visitors stopped instinctively beside it. There they stood, the young girl a little ahead of the escorts, reading the tender message of the stones. Hans Kastorp relaxed, his hands clasped before him, with open mouth and sleepy eyes. Young Zeisman at attention, not merely erect, but even leaning a little backward. The cousins, both at the same moment, cast stolen, sidelong glances at Karen Karstad's face. She noticed, however, and as she stood there, bashful and demure, she thrust her head forward at a slight tilt and smiled affectedly, with pursed lips, blinking her eyes rapidly. Well, even here, the dying woman, who is staring at her own tomb, does not respond to the prospect of imminent death with the dignified solemnity that Hans is looking for. Even Karen. Instead, she sees them watching her and adopts a flirtatious pose, pursing her lips and batting her eyelids. Overall, then, Hans's first-hand investigations into the double nature of death as a physical and spiritual phenomenon are less satisfying than his intellectual explorations had been into the double nature of physical and spiritual creation. Before leaving the Danse Macabre, however, I want to consider Mann's fascinating disquisition on early silent film, because this is what Hans and Joachim and Karen see in the town of Plotz on another excursion. Film is the most recent in a series of visual technologies that Mann describes in the novel, from parlor amusements like the kinetoscope and stereoscope, and including even the X-ray machinery, as I've described. But in the early 20th century, none of those devices did something that altered the episteme the way film did. Because what film did was it changed perceptions of time and space in a way none of the other proto-cinematic devices or X-ray or parlor entertainments could. The images projected in early film were captured, of course, from life at moments in the past and in places far from where the spectator is seated. As such, film, silent film, emerges as a dangerous technology capable of dislocating the human subject and deranging the senses, because what we see is in a different place and it was filmed at a different time. We're told that as they sat in the cinema, up ahead on the screen, life flickered before the smarting eyes, all sorts of life, chopped up in hurried, diverting scraps, and leapt into fidgety action, lingered and twitched out of sight in alarm, to the accompaniment of trivial music, which offered present rhythms to match the vanishing phantoms from the past, and which, despite limited means, ran the gamut of solemnity, pomposity, passion, savagery, and cooing sensuality. The actors who had been cast in these plays they had seen had long since been scattered to the winds. They had watched then on the screen only phantoms whose deeds had been reduced to 1,000,000 photographs brought into focus for the briefest moments, so that as often as one liked, they could then be given back to the element of time. A series of blinking flashes could be seen again and again. Once the illusion was over, there was something repulsive about the crowd's nerveless silence. Now, finally, we are told of this that they saw on the screen the capture of wild elephants, a ceremony at the Siamese court, a street of brothels in Japan with geishas sitting caged behind wooden lattices. They watched semioids bundled in furs driving sleds pulled by reindeer across the snowy waste of northern Asia, Russian pilgrims praying at Hebron, a Persian criminal being batansod, and they were present at each of these. Space, like time, was negated. Time turned back, space was negated, and then there, transformed by music into a skittering phantasmagoric here and now. Now, the coordinates then of time and space, of here and now, are shattered, leaving the amazed audience in a state of stunned silence. That something filmed a year before is now present, that people who aren't present physically are present somehow, spatially, from a different place, now in your location. It leaves the audience wondering, then, what is real and what isn't. It deranges the entire episteme. Now, you'll note that the great German cultural critic, some of you are probably familiar with, Walter Benjamin, speaks of photography and film as part of what he describes as a crisis in perception in modern life, one in which the overstimulated mind is bombarded with images detached from familiar frameworks of time and space, generated by the click of a camera shutter or the start of a cinema reel. And as Benjamin puts it, technology subjects the human sensorium to a series of mind-altering shocks. The effect of this in the early 20th century, of this displacement of time and space, is shock. And as part of this new perceptual regimen in the early 20th century, film in particular is magical in Mann's description. But it is also frightening in its disruption of spatial and temporal reality, in the deranging of those coordinates, which, as we've seen certainly in the case of time, are already complicated and paradoxical enough, even without film. But film is dangerous, one might note. To conclude this consideration of film, it's dangerous in another way for Mann. Remember that Mann is writing in the 1920s, a decade or more before the novel is set. And anticipating later film theorists, Mann implicitly links the viewing of films to the experience of dreaming. Film is a phantasmagoric projection of images that reveal and gratify and sometimes encourage our secret wishes. And Mann knows that that's potentially dangerous because some of those secret wishes are deeply transgressive and even brutal, and film seems somehow to gratify them. Thus, we're told, then suddenly the film slowed to linger revealingly on the muscular arm of an executioner. In short, it had been produced with a sympathetic understanding of its international audience and catered to that civilization's secret wishes. Well, remember, he's writing this in the early 1920s. This is after the Holocaust, after the brutalities of the Nazi Reich in Germany. It's as if Mann is suggesting that in some way what we see projected on a cinema screen can liberate those same brutal instincts, the way dreams do and the way certain dictators and figures of power tap into. Okay. Well, speaking of mind-altering phantasmagoria, the time has come at last to explore the climax of Hans's relationship with Claudia and of the first half of The Magic Mountain. Walpurgisnacht. This is simply one of the great chapters in all of modern literature. Now, here it helps to know something about the particular reference in the title, as in earlier Danse Macabre. This title, Walpurgisnacht, derives from German folklore, and more specifically from a famous scene in Goethe's Faust, an important intertext in this novel. A scene in Faust that is set on Walpurgisnacht. That is a night, in German folk belief, when it was thought that witches gathered and danced on the so-called Magic Mountain in central Germany, in the Harz Mountain, They danced atop the magic mountain that was known as the Brocken. Now, it was believed in folk lore that these celebrations of witches occurred on April 30th, okay? And they chose April 30th because that was the eve of the feast of Saint Walpurga, who was an 8th century abbess. How it was that the abbess became associated with these unholy rites is mysterious. In any case, Walpurgisnacht, like Mardi Gras, is a time of license, okay? And indeed, it is not April 30th when they occur at the Berghof. Rather, it is Mardi Gras. It's February, but the sentiments and the particular nature of celebration between the two festivities are very similar. Both are nights of magic, revelry, debauchery, drinking, and forbidden Dionysian revels. Both on Walpurgisnacht and on Mardi Gras, transformations occur. People act out their fantasies. Dark powers seem to be abroad. Okay? In short, it's a time, Mardi Gras and Walpurgisnacht, when all of the restraints of both bourgeois modesty and of Apollonianism collapse. An occasion when the Freudian superego surrenders to the drives of the id. Now, all this happens at the Berghof as we see the patients in this frenzy, what is really a kind of dance of death, in costume, riotously intoxicated, dancing with one another, decked out as some of the very things that they use in their illness. A silent sister was capering with Blue Henry, and Fra Solomon, who was dressed like a gentleman in evening clothes, a swallowtail coat, white vest, amply filled shirt, monocle, and painted-on mustache, spun about on her little patent leather high-heeled shoes, which looked very much out of place with her long black men's trousers, in the arms of Puccinello, whose lips shone bloody red in the whitened face, and whose eyes looked like an albino rabbit's. The prosecutor was in his kimono. Fra Wombach, the consul's general wife, and young Ganser were dancing in a threesome with their arms thrown about one another, cross-dressing, multiple partners. Fra Stur danced with her broom in the form of a witch, pressing to her heart and caressing its bristles as if they were the hair on a man's head. Okay, now, ancient folk festivals of this kind are not unlike dreams. So after witnessing this, Hans says, as we'll see to Claudia, let's sit here and watch as if in a dream. It's like a dream for me, you know, for me to be sitting here like this. Well, these revelries, rooted in ancient tradition, are like dreams, as Hans suggests, in that they are the expression and enactment of things that have long been suppressed, that have been desired but not yet actualized. And indeed, as Hans tells Claudia that this is like a dream for him, and as he goes on to describe to her the passion that he feels, he says that he is living out a dream, now fulfilling that which had before been longed for but suppressed. But note that this atavistic carnival is a liberation, but a dangerous one. Because it's a night, of course, when a man can fall into sin or confusion, or worse, he can even be destroyed. Now, even Mann's ironic narrator pretends to be so infected by the dangerous, reckless spirit of the carnival that he has to hold himself back from rushing ahead with the story. Rather charmingly, he tells us, by the evening, both in the dining hall and the social rooms, the festivities continued to grow until at one point, and then we get an ellipsis, at this juncture, we alone know to what this carnival festivities eventually led, thanks to Hans Castorp's enterprising spirit. But we are not about to let our knowledge of what happened disrupt the deliberate pace of our narrative. Instead, we shall give time and honor to it and do not rush into things. Okay. Thus, he warns us not to go too fast and warns himself. Now, with respect to the warning of others, specifically the ever-vigilant Settembrini, to try to hold Hans back from going too fast or going at all, that warning against rushing ahead fails. Settembrini sees the dangers that Hans faces in this fevered atmosphere. And so he offers Hans an initial warning in the form of lines from Goethe's Faust, when he says, echoing the language of Goethe's scene on the bracken, "But bear in mind the mountain's mad with spells tonight, and should a will-o'-wisp decide your light, beware, its lead may prove deceptive." Well, that warning to Hans about the dangers of madness, of deception, of surrender to this atmosphere, that warning fails because on this night of all nights, Hans has thrown caution to the wind. In fact, he has the entire evening been gazing at Klavdia's body, which is now more tantalizingly visible than ever before. He looks at her attire with hypnotized longing, as if he were seeing her pale flesh for the first time in a moment of breathtaking revelation. In contrast to her sexually alluring gown, however, Klavdia wears on her head a childish paper hat that only makes her dark, sleeveless attire somehow seem all the more provocative. We're told that the dress she is wearing left Klavdia's arms bare all the way to the shoulder, her arms so tender and full at the same time and cool, one could only presume, so that they stood out extraordinarily white against the dark shadows of silk. The effect was so overwhelming that Hans Castorp closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "My God, he had never seen a dress cut like that." The full, heightened, dazzling nakedness of the splendid limbs of a sick, infected organism turned out to be an experience far more potent than the day's illusion, a phenomenon for which there alone was one response, and Hans lowered his head again and silently repeated, "My God." Well, we know where this is going to go. Weeks earlier, Hans, you remember, Settembrini, weeks earlier, had warned Hans not to yield to Klavdia, as Ulysses' men had yielded to the witch Circe in the Odyssey, because Circe had turned all of Odysseus's men into pigs. Now, bear in mind that Walpurgisnacht is a night of witches. Circe was herself a witch. And this trope of Circeism is picked up on Walpurgisnacht, this aspect of a certain kind of witch, when the drunken throng, inspired by Baron's example, amuse themselves by trying to draw pigs with their eyes closed. Thus, the danger of Hans's succumbing to Klavdia's Circe-like witchy erotic spell is especially strong on this particular night. And on this particular night, Settembrini's warning against not yet surrendering to a Circe are all the more hopeless. And yet, ever attentive, Settembrini continues to watch Hans as Hans is watching Klavdia. And once again, he sounds an alarm, citing yet another literary source, this time not Goethe or Homer, but rather the Gnostic Gospels. Settembrini tells him, "'Tis Lilith," explaining that Lilith was the first wife of Adam in what turns out to be yet another but different Gnostic version of creation and fall. In that particular version, Lilith tempts Adam into sin and then reveals herself as a serpent, essentially a feminized Satan. Thus, the implication is, stay away from Klavdia. She is Lilith. She is evil. She will seduce you. Okay? Don't be taken in by her beauty. Hans's reaction to this, yet another censorious warning, is so aggressive in defiance that it stuns Settembrini. Hans wants deliberately and immediately to offend his protective Apollonian mentor, this humanist, and he does so by using a kind of informal intimacy of address, as if to show that he has already been infected by Klavdia's witchery and that he will violate all decorum and all Settembrini's ideas of decency. He speaks to him now by his first name and then uses the more intimate pronoun after this warning about Lilith. He speaks to him and says, and so you're here to turn the lights back on, so to speak, aren't you? Remember, he had turned them on in Hans's room. So you can set young men back on the right path. Isn't it that? Isn't what you're up to, Lodovico? Hans said giddily. He had drunk quite a bit of Burgundy and champagne. Now listen, that's enough of that, my good young engineer, said Settembrini. commanded with a scowl. You will please use forms of address appropriate to the educated West. No first names. Formal pronouns, if you please. What are you trying to do there? It doesn't suit you at all. Yes, yes. For people to use informal pronouns or first names when they have no real reason to do so is a repulsively barbaric practice, a slovenly game, a way of playing with the givens of civilization and human progress. Don't do it again. Well, weeks earlier, you remember, Hans would have probably bowed to this, but not now, because he not only turns away from Settembrini here, defiantly, but he's going to use the same informal, intimate pronoun, you, the familiar you, and the same first name when he speaks to Clavia. But he's going to do it with her, of course, out of a passionate desire to communicate, rather than out of this rebellious affront to his mentor. But the important thing to bear in mind here is that he's going to do it in French. Now, we'll see why. Infected by his desire to draw pigs, along with the others, clearly under a Circean spell, Hans finds that he needs a pencil in order to join in this delirious merriment. And recalling Prislav Hippie, from whom he had borrowed a pencil when he was an adolescent, that memory provides the long-awaited pretext for approaching Clavdia and speaking to her after so many months for the first time. We're told that no one had a pencil for him. Hans turned around and walked back into the room, continuing to shout, headed directly toward Clavdia Chauchat, who, as he well knew, was standing just beyond the portieres in the little salon, smiling and watching the goings-on around the punch bowl. Hans, however, was standing in the brick schoolyard, staring up close into a pair of blue-gray-green apathetic eyes above prominent cheekbones, and he said, then as now, do you have a pencil, perhaps? He was pale as death, as pale as on the day when he returned from his solitary walk, still pattered with blood. He looked almost like a corpse. Do you mean me? The bare-armed patient replied in response to the familiar pronoun in his question. Yes, I might. At most her smile and voice suggested the kind of excitement that comes when the first words in a long, silent relationship are spoken at last. A subtle excitement, secretly incorporating into this one moment everything that has happened until now. You are very ambitious, she said. You're very, very eager, she said, likewise using personal pronouns. Continuing, as she did so, to mock him in her exotic accent with its strange R and strange open E. Okay, now, the moment of Hans's approach to this woman who embodies for him both eros and disease and death, that moment, we're told, is almost like death itself. It is such a terrifying breakthrough. But it is also, of course, a release and an awakening more fully into being, sensual being, life for Hans. The two go hand in hand. As Settembrini sees this and sees Hans walking toward Clavdia to borrow this pencil, Settembrini utters a cry, and extends his arm in a final gesture of warning and dismay that Mons says, whose meaning is hard to put into words. There are so many things that are hard to express in this chapter, even for Settembrini. This leads us to an important question as we consider now this meeting between Hans and Clavdia. As we see him waiting for her response to his request for the borrowing of a pencil, as he had waited for the pencil from Prislav Hippie, let us pause to ask why. After an initial awkward exchange in German, what little German Clavdia seems to know, why after that Hans and Clavdia conduct this extraordinary conversation in French. It is because just as Hans thinks of Latin as the appropriate language for discussing the solemnity of death, so too he regards French as the natural language for expressing love. Well, a Frenchman might say, yeah, that's why, but it's not. That's not why the two of them are speaking French. nor why Hans finds in this foreign tongue the liberation he needs in order to describe his passion for Claudia in a way he could have never done in German. It's not that there is anything intrinsically magical or love-related in French. So why French then? Well, pragmatically, Hans speaks absolutely no Russian, and Claudia's German is, as she tells him, halting and rudimentary at best. Neither speaks French as their first language, but they both share it as a secondary tongue. So this means then that in communicating in this secondary language, they must both speak with unusual effort and care. They must think about the weight and meaning of their words as they rarely do in their native tongues. Now, there are words and idioms that come so readily to one, of course, that you never reflect on the significance of what those words means. As Hans puts it, the phrases one uses every day have no real significance here whatever. Now, because Hans and Claudia then must labor to speak in French, their words are more authentic, more direct, less idiomatic. That is, their words have a better chance of mapping the things and feelings that they're describing and a better chance of connecting mind with mind, listener with speaker. Now, at the Berghof, Hans has gradually become a language skeptic after his initial fascination with Settembrini's volubility. Hans has noted how people define abstract words like civilization and freedom differently. He's noted how different professions, like medical people, speak in a highly specialized language that others don't understand. And he has seen how terrible it is to be linguistically isolated, like tous les deux. Well, how then can one overcome these limitations that seem to trace back, mythically speaking at least, to the Tower of Babel? The words of one's native tongue are like coins that have lost their images, their impressions, either through cultural overuse or through an over-specialized personal use. But, by contrast, the French words that Hans uses seem to him newly minted because he has never attempted to express feelings of such intensity in this language before. Indeed, Hans wonders if there are even words in his familiar German vocabulary that would have been able to express these feelings that he has, because that language, German, is bound up for Hans not just with overfamiliarity, but with a tradition of bourgeois restraint. The labor of speaking in French liberates these feelings and makes them seem real, as they are new. Thus, another reason for French, as I've just noted, is that it releases feelings that would have been held back in German, not just that it somehow requires a labor to be more precise. French becomes then the language both of precision and of release, of honesty on this dreamlike night, as Hans speaks to Claudia. I barely speak French all the same. I would rather speak with you in it, though, than any other, than my own language, he tells her, since for me, speaking French is like speaking without saying anything somehow, with no responsibilities, the way we speak in a dream. Before this, he had said, what good are words? Why speak? Speak, discourse. Yes, he's a skeptic of language, but when he discovers that he can barely speak French somehow, that seems appropriate. Note that although it is Hans who explains that somehow in French one isn't inhibited, there are no responsibilities as there would be in my own language, and that for me speaking French is like speaking without saying anything I would ordinarily, although it is Hans who theorizes why French is so much more effective than German would have been for him, it is Claudia who initiates speaking French in their encounter. She initiates it when he asks to borrow the pencil, and her response, as she pulls it out, is to say, voila. Voila. That initiates the entire conversation that ensues. This mechanical pencil that she holds is one in which we're told she both offers it to him and at the same time seems curiously to be holding it back. Voila, she said, and picked the little pencil up by the tip, holding it between thumb and forefinger and wagging it back and forth. She both gave it to him and held it back, so that he took it without actually taking hold of it, raising his hand very close to the pencil, his fingers ready to grasp it, but not actually grasping. And the gaze from his leaden eye sockets shifted between the object and Claudia's Tartar face. His bloodless lips were open, and they stayed open, unused, as he said, "You see, I knew it, I knew you'd have one. Prenez garde, il est un peu fragile," she said. Yeah, be careful, it's very fragile, take care of it. Now, note then that this behavior, of course, is perfectly consistent with a femme fatale, leading him on, teasing him with the pencil, moving it toward him and away from him. Well, after voila, and then after the prenez garde, both of which are presented in the text in French, you should be aware that all of the italicized text in this chapter that follow is meant to be understood as French that the two of them are exchanging. And I will make this point. In Mann's German version, and also in the original English translation by H.T. Loporter, the passages that are italicized in English here were actually printed in French, requiring non-French readers, which would have included Mann's own German audience, as well as an English audience, requiring us to struggle with those exchanges just as Claudia and Hans struggle, but ever so expressively, with the language. Mann wants us to find it unfamiliar, fresh. He wants to defamiliarize the language for us as for them so that it means more, in order to grasp both the difficulties and the possibilities of that language when it is spoken as they are speaking it with maximum urgency. So try to imagine that. Well, Claudia immediately sees Hans's nervousness. She mocks him for his nervousness and for his eagerness at the same time. But a moment later, she invites Hans to use French with her. In French, she refers to him as a respectable young man who, as a German, loves order more than liberty. It's a kind of provocation, okay? Even when it seems that she's simply going to allow him to borrow the pencil. No. She returns and speaks in French. Hans then responds to this in French, first picking up on that word love when she said Germans love order more than liberty. But he focuses on that word love, of course, which he's going to return to repeatedly and compellingly throughout the course of the conversation. But also note something about Claudia's remark that Germans love order more than they love liberty. On this night of release in all forms, liberty is, of course, a major consideration. But we're reminded, even as we see Hans and Claudia using language as a medium for communication, that other words, such as liberty, freedom, are far more ambiguous. And we noted, for example, that different characters define liberty in different fashions. Settembrini defines it in the context of political liberty and the labor to an all-ever-progressing future. Krakowski defines it in terms of the freedom of discovering one's unconscious desires. And Claudia mocks the idea that Germans don't really know what liberty means because they are so preoccupied with repressive modes of order. But note that Hans's response to liberty is very different. Hans regards liberty as a function of intellectual development, the freedom to speculate and to think. And this is, I think, related to what Claudia says when she observes that my illness allows me my liberty. In a certain sense, this is true of Hans as well. Different kinds of ways of being free because one is sick, but they share that. Hans's sudden, passionate approach to Claudia on Walpurgis Nacht, after so many months of silence, and his use immediately of the intimate tu as he speaks to her in French, is so disconcerting to Claudia, the self-styled femme fatale, that she actually pauses for a moment, surprised, and takes a step backward. When Hans declares that he would like to study her skin as Barons has studied it, she says momentarily, "Hey, please, sir, speak German." As if to say, you're going too far here. But this admonition is only temporary, and I think we would be wrong to assume that the passion in this encounter is only one-sided, that Claudia doesn't share Hans's interest. No, Claudia has, after all, long watched Hans as he has watched her. Indeed, she has watched him watching her. She's discovered his secrets just as he has investigated hers. She knows things about him. So, when Hans urges Claudia to follow him after borrowing the pencil into a corner for a more intimate chat, Claudia feels compelled by something in herself. We're told, he says to her, "You have not drawn yet. You must draw now," he said, leaving out the M in must and taking a step back to let Claudia pass. "Do you mean me?" she said again, and this time her astonishment seemed directed at more than his request. At first she stood there smiling in some confusion, but then, as if pulled by a magnetic force, she followed him as he backed away and toward the punch table. It is she who is now drawn by a peculiar magnetic force invested in Hans. Well, what is it, this magnetic force? What draws Claudia to Hans? It is, I think, a function or something akin to his attraction to her, a fascination with her opposite, which is to say, a fascination with her own submerged nature embodied or reflected in Hans. If Hans craves in her a passionate, dissolute, Dionysian part of himself, Claudia is drawn to Hans as a pure, upstanding, middle-class man from order-loving Germany. This is how she wants to see him, because that is how and why she is drawn to him as a kind of emanation of a subterranean aspect of herself. She wants to see him as a bourgeois young man that she can know, seduce, and perhaps even corrupt. Thus, she repeatedly calls him "my little bourgeois." She says to him at such moments, "All those things you have established in regard to your morality, you and your ailing compatriot, do you seriously suppose—" well, that's the subject requiring a little thought, she said to him. "You are a decent, simple fellow, from a good family, with handsome manners, a docile pupil in his teachers, who will soon return to the flatlands in order to forget completely that he ever spoke in a dream here, and to help repay his great, powerful fatherland with his honest labor on the wharves. Yes, that's what you'll do, decent, simple little fellow." Now, in saying this, of course, Claudia is oversimplifying Hans for the sake of her own desire to seduce him and to in some way reduce him to that submerged aspect of herself that she wants fully to know. She envisions him as innocent as he was, as bourgeois as he was when he arrived, as the opposite of her own passionate, transgressive, reckless self. But of course, Hans is more than that now. Seeing him that way, though, nonetheless, arouses her, and this is why she delights in taunting him, in trying to embarrass him, in hoping to shock him with her own evocation of her Asiatic wickedness and recklessness. It seems to us, by which she means people like me, the one ought not to search for morality in virtue, which is to say in reason, in discipline, in good behavior, in respectability, but rather just the opposite, I would say, in sin, in abandoning oneself to danger, to whatever harm us, can destroy us. It seems to us that it is more moral to lose oneself and oneself to be ruined than to save oneself. The great moralists have never been especially virtuous, but rather adventurers in evil, in vice, great sinners who teach Christians how to stoop to misery. Oh, you must find all this very repugnant. Yes, you you bourgeois, you pupil of an Apollonian. But the thing is, of course, Hans isn't shocked by this. He already knows it and is aroused by it. And knowing it prompts, of course, a pivotal question in Hans. How can he dare to ask a question that he can now dare to ask because he, after all, has nothing to lose? Klavdia has just told him that she's going away, at least for a time, and we're told the whole world was collapsing within Hans, so why not simply ask this question? After he says, no, you haven't shocked me, consider what he says. All those things you have established, Klavdia, in regard to morality, you and your alluring compatriot, do you seriously suppose that they surprise me? What sort of adult do you take me for? So tell me then, what do you think of me? It sounds like a simple question, but what Hans really means in that question is, do you desire me? Could you ever love me if and when you return? Now, Klavdia refuses to answer that implicit question, just as she has deferred Hans's request to see her X-ray, and just as she refuses to dance. But note, her X-ray being her inner portrait, she defers, she refuses all of these things at this point. As a woman who embodies the Dionysian, Klavdia doesn't need to join in these amateur, seasonal dances and festivities. But she also doesn't answer the question, what do you think of me? Which is clearly a couched way of saying, do you love me? Could you love me? By posing the unanswered question, Hans, however, even without a response from her, provides for himself the long-delayed but absolutely necessary opportunity to declare to Klavdia how he feels about her, what he thinks of her. And indeed, in the course of this extraordinary, passionate, almost delirious monologue, he uses 6 French words that he repeats with a kind of almost fetishistic fervor to evoke the complex nature of his attraction to her and love for her, in order to give that desire the fullest possible sense of reality and communicative weight. Those 6 words are love, l'amour, death, la mort, desire, désir, disease, maladie, fever, fièvre, and body, corps. Klavdia is all of those things wrapped into one for Hans. Thus, he says, but death, you see, is on the one hand something disputable, so impotent that it makes you blush with shame, and on the other something solemn. It's a majestic force. But then he moves from death to her. In the same way, the body and love of the body, too, are indecent and disagreeable. The body's surface blushes and turns pale because it's afraid or ashamed of itself, but at the same time it is a great divine glory, a miraculous image of organic life, a holy miracle of form and beauty and love in it. And the human body, it's likewise extremely humanistic affair, after an educating force greater than all the pedagogy in the world. Ah, the ravishing organic beauty, not done in oils or stone, but made in the living and corruptible matter, full of the feverish secret of life and decay. Consider the marvelous symmetry of the human frame, the shoulders and the hips and the breast as they blossom on each side of the chest, and the ribs arranged in pairs, and the navel set amid the supple belly, and the dark sexual organs between the thighs. Consider the shoulder blade shifting beneath the silky skin of the back, and the spine descending into the fresh, doubled luxuriance of the buttocks, and the great network of the veins and the nerves that branch out from the trunk through the armpits, and the way the structure of the arms corresponds to that of the legs. Oh, the sweet inner surfaces of the elbow and the hollow of the knee, and their abundance of organic delicacies beneath the padding of flesh. What an immense festival of caresses lies in those delicious zones of the human body, a festival of death with no weeping afterward. Yes, good God. Oh, Klavdia, let me smell the odor of the skin on your knee, beneath which the ingeniously segmented capsule secretes its slippery oil. Let me touch in devotion your pulsing femoral artery where it emerges at the top of your thigh and then divides further down into the 2 arteries of the tibia. Let me take in the exaltation of your pores and the brush of the down. Oh, my human image made of water and protein, destined for the contours of the grave. Let me perish. Press my lips against yours. Has there ever been a love declaration quite as anatomical and quite as overpowering as that? Hans makes this declaration, we're told, on bended knee. He was now bending beside her, his head bent low, his whole body quivering. "I love you," he babbled. "I have always loved you. You are the intimate you of my life, my dream, my destiny, my need, my eternal desire. I recognized you as my love. It's true, before I ever saw you, with your marvelous slanting eyes and your mouth. Before even then." Looking down, she said, "Come, come, come, if your teachers could see you now." But then Claudia softly stroked the short-cropped hair at the back of Hans's head with one hand. "My little bourgeois," she said, "my handsome bourgeois with a little moist spot. Is it true that you love me so much?" Thrilled by the touch on both knees, head thrown back, eyes closed, he went on, "Ah, love, you know, the body, the fate, death are simply one and the same." The body, love, death, eros, it's all one, and it is all you. Now, this declaration, made on bended knee, is one of profane adoration, in which Hans conveys to Claudia in this long monologue, I think, three important ideas. First, that he loved her before he ever met her, loved her in the form of Prislav hippie, which makes his love ultimately timeless in his mind. Second, he insists that his fever, his disease, is the manifestation of this immortal love for her, that he is sick because of his desire for her. And third, he tells her that love, death, sickness, and fever are all entwined because they are all carnal. Love, like disease, is a sickening of life on its way to intensive consciousness and ultimately to death. What is Claudia to do under the force of this combination of sexual ardor and metaphysics? Well, this is definitely not the conduct of the healthy little bourgeois that she had wanted to see in Hans. This is the declaration of something far more hybrid, far more complex. But Claudia is nonetheless aroused by something else here. She's aroused by Hans' arousal. She's moved by the lyrical force of his declaration in another language that seems magically to free him into a passionate outpouring that even she has probably never heard before. Language succeeds here. That repetition of those 6 words I've mentioned, love, death, desire, disease, fever, and body, it succeeds as in conveying the force of that desire. She understands Hans' words and what he means and what she means to him. And so, to demonstrate this in the passage I read, as he declares his love, which he regards as timeless, she touches him, as Hans had dreamed she would, not yet with a kiss, but rather stroking his head, just as Hans describes to Claudia the double nature of death, which he suggests is both spiritual and physical, so too that he claims that his desire for her is born of a love that is not just Dionysian carnality, but also Apollonian form, in his description of the symmetrical way in which you have the double luxuriance of the buttocks, the network of veins so perfectly formed and ordered. Although he lays emphasis upon the formal shape of the body, however, it becomes more and more clear as he moves to the description of the padding of the flesh behind her knees and his desire to press his lips to the veins that he can see in her arms, while he claims, in short, that he adores her both for the beauty of her Apollonian form and the corruptible erotic force of her flesh, it's clearly the latter more than the formal here in this exalted rhapsody. Because what he longs for clearly is a kind of erotic consummation, as well as a metaphysical possession, but an erotic consummation in which his fascination with physical corruption in the sort of blooming splendor of her diseased body overwhelms any Apollonian admiration of the symmetry of her limbs and buttocks. Hans would almost, as he describes Claudia's body here, and press his lips to it with its delicious zones, it's almost as if Hans in his longing for possession, wants to ingest her, to consume her with every possible sensory organ. But what has this delirious homage to Claudia's body gained him? Well, the scene ends this way. She said, "You are indeed a gallant suitor, one who knows how to woo in a very profound German fashion." This is not a typical German fashion, nonetheless. And she set her paper hat on his head. "Adieu, my carnival prince. I can predict that you will see a nasty rise in your fever chart this evening." She's right about that. Then she glided out of her chair, glided across the carpet to the door, where she stopped and turned halfway back to Hans, one bare arm raised, a hand on the hinge. Over her shoulder, she said softly, "Don't forget to return my pencil." And she left. She came in through a door before Hans ever saw her early in the novel. Now she leaves through a door, but let us consider her words. At first, they don't seem very encouraging. She, after all, continues to mock Hans as a gallant little gentleman, teasing him, even infantilizing him, as she puts the childish Mardi Gras hat on his head. She teases him that his temperature will rise, and she even, not very convincingly, says, yes, this is, of course, the way in which a gallant German would court a woman. But then, wonderfully, she pauses as she walks away and offers an invitation, just as she had, remember, offered Hans the invitation to speak to her in French when she said, "Voila." Now she says, "Don't forget to return my pencil." Okay? These, remember, were Prislav Hippie's words, but on Claudia's lips they mean something else. They mean, "Come to my bedroom, Carnival Prince. Bring the pencil back." We learned later that Hans does. And we'll talk about that next time. See you later.